"That old medal doesn't make you special," they sneered, pointing at the Purple Heart pinned to her jacket. Victoria sat quietly in the corner booth, saying nothing, as the group of college students mocked her military service and questioned why she even wore the decoration. But when a 4-star general walked through that diner door, stood at attention, and saluted her with tears in his eyes, they realized that old medal represented a sacrifice that had saved an entire platoon and changed the course of military history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Copper Kettle Diner in Millbrook Falls had always been the kind of place where locals gathered to share stories and catch up on town gossip. Its red vinyl booths and checkerboard floor had witnessed countless conversations over the past 40 years, but none quite like what was about to unfold on this crisp October evening. Victoria Thorne sat alone in the corner booth, the same spot she'd claimed every Tuesday night for the past 6 months since moving to this quiet mountain town. At 52, she preferred the solitude and anonymity that Millbrook Falls offered after decades of a life she rarely spoke about. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain black jacket over dark jeans. Unremarkable in every way except for the small, distinctive medal pinned carefully to her left lapel. The Purple Heart caught the diner's warm light, its gold edges gleaming softly against the purple and white ribbon. Most people in town had grown accustomed to seeing it there, though few understood its significance. To them, Victoria was simply the quiet woman who worked part-time at Henderson's hardware store, lived alone in the small apartment above Riverside, books, and kept to herself. Tonight, however, the usual peaceful atmosphere was disrupted by a group of college students from nearby Clearwater University who had driven down for what they called a small-town experience. 5 young adults, all around 20 years old, had taken over the large booth across from Victoria, their voices carrying easily across the small diner as they laughed and talked about their classes, their futures, and their opinions about everything, from politics to social media. Initially, Victoria had paid them no attention, focusing instead on her usual Tuesday dinner: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, accompanied by black coffee and a slice of Dorothy's famous apple pie. She'd brought along a worn paperback novel, something she'd read many times before, and was content to spend her evening in comfortable solitude. But as the evening progressed, the students' conversation grew louder and more animated. They'd been discussing a recent campus protest about military recruitment on their university grounds, debating whether the armed forces had any place in modern society. Their voices carried the confidence of youth and the certainty of those who had never faced real hardship. "I mean, seriously," declared a young man with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive sweater. "What's the point of all this military worship? It's just government propaganda to keep the war machine running." A young woman with multiple piercings and a "question everything" t-shirt nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And don't even get me started on all these so-called heroes walking around expecting special treatment. Like you chose to go fight someone else's war. Why should we thank you for that?" Their conversation might have remained just another example of youthful idealism if not for what happened next. The blond young man, perhaps emboldened by his beau friend's agreement, noticed Victoria sitting alone with her medal clearly visible. "Hey, look at that," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the diner as he pointed directly at her. "Perfect example right there. Check out the old lady with the participation trophy." Victoria's hand tightened slightly around her coffee cup, but she didn't look up from her book. She'd heard worse, experienced far more painful moments than anything these children could inflict with their words. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially not with people who had no context for understanding what real battle meant. But the students, perhaps mistaking her silence for weakness or inability to hear them, grew bolder. The young woman with the piercings leaned forward, studying Victoria with theatrical intensity. "Oh my God, is that supposed to be a Purple Heart?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Like from some old war nobody cares about anymore?" Her friend, a young man with a carefully groomed beard and wire-rimmed glasses, chimed in with the authority of someone who'd taken a few history classes. "Those things are basically handed out like candy now. Stub your toe in Afghanistan, get a medal. It's all about creating this mythology of heroism to justify military spending." Victoria finally looked up from her book, her gray eyes meeting theirs briefly before returning to the page. She'd perfected this response over the years: acknowledge without engaging, show that she heard them without giving them the confrontation they seemed to be seeking, but her calm response only seemed to encourage them further. The blonde young man stood up, his movements exaggerated and theatrical, clearly performing for his friend's amusement. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone of respect, "we're just wondering, what exactly did you do to earn that shiny medal? Paper cut? Hangnail? Maybe you got a really bad sunburn while sitting on a base somewhere safe?" The diner had grown quiet now, other patrons looking uncomfortable but uncertain whether to intervene. Dorothy Martinez, the diner's owner and head waitress, paused in her cleaning, her expression darkening as she watched the scene unfold. Victoria closed her book slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She placed it carefully on the table beside her plate, her hands steady despite the attention now focused on her. For a moment, it seemed she might finally respond, might finally give these young people a glimpse of the reality behind their casual mockery. Instead, she simply reached into her purse, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table next to her barely touched pie. She stood up slowly, her movements betraying a slight stiffness that spoke of old injuries and long-healed wounds. "That old medal doesn't make you special," the pierced young woman called out as Victoria walked toward the door, her voice carrying the cruel confidence of someone who had never truly suffered. "It's just a piece of metal for doing what you signed up to do." Victoria paused at the door, her hand on the handle, her back still turned to the room. For just a moment, her shoulders seemed to carry the weight of memories these young people couldn't begin to imagine. Then she pushed through the door and disappeared into the October night, leaving behind a group of students who had no idea that their mockery had just targeted one of the most decorated female combat veterans in American military history. But they were about to find out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Copper Kettle Diner had been the beating heart of Millbrook Falls for over 4 decades, serving as the unofficial town hall where locals gathered to discuss everything from high school football scores to county politics. Located on the corner of Main Street and Riverside Drive, the diner's neon sign flickered invitingly against the mountain backdrop, drawing in travelers from the winding highway that cut through the Colorado Rockies. Dorothy Martinez had owned the establishment for 15 years, taking it over from the original owners when she moved to town with her late husband. She'd maintained its authentic 1950s charm, the black and white checkered floor, red vinyl booths, and chrome fixtures that reflected the warm glow of pendant lights hanging over each table. The walls were decorated with vintage photographs of the town's history, local high school sports teams, and the occasional celebrity who'd stopped by during their travels through the mountains. On any given evening, the diner hosted a predictable cast of characters. There was old Pete Garrison, the retired forest ranger who claimed the same corner stool at the counter every night, nursing his coffee and sharing stories about his 30 years in the wilderness. The Morrison family, Jim, his wife Helen, and their twin teenage daughters occupied their usual booth every Tuesday after the girls' volleyball practice. Sarah Chun, the town librarian, often graded papers in the booth by the window, her red pen moving steadily across student assignments while she sipped her herbal tea. These were the people who formed the fabric of Millbrook Falls, a tight-knit community of roughly 3,000 souls who knew each other's business, celebrated each other's successes, and rallied together during difficult times. They were farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and mechanics, retirees who'd chosen the mountains for their golden years and young, families drawn by the town's promise of safety and simplicity, the college students who had driven down from Clearwater. University represented a different world entirely. Clearwater was only 40 minutes away, but it might as well have been on another planet. The university town buzzed with coffee shops, boutique stores, and the constant energy of 18,000 students pursuing their dreams and debating the world's problems with the passionate certainty of youth. These 5 students, Brad Westfield, Amber Rodriguez, Jake Patterson, Emma Sinclair, and Tyler Brooks, were typical of their generation. They carried the latest smartphones, wore clothes that cost more than most Millbrook Falls residents, spent on groceries in a month, and spoke with the confidence of those who'd been told since childhood that their opinions mattered. Their voices deserved to be heard, and their generation would change the world. Brad, the blonde with the expensive sweater, was a political science major whose father owned 3 car dealerships in Denver. He'd grown up in suburban comfort, attending private schools and spending summers at leadership camps where he'd learned to debate and argue with sophisticated vocabulary. To him, the military represented an outdated institution, a relic of a more primitive time when humanity solved problems with violence instead of diplomacy. Amber, with her carefully curated collection of piercings and her question everything t-shirt, was studying sociology with a minor in women's studies. She'd written papers on the military-industrial complex and the way society glorified violence through its worship of soldiers. Her professors had praised her critical thinking, her ability to see through propaganda and challenge accepted narratives. Jake, the bearded young man with wire-rimmed glasses, was pursuing a double major in history and peace studies. He'd read extensively about America's military interventions, could quote statistics about defense spending, and had written a thesis arguing that most military decorations were political theater, designed to manufacture consent for future wars. Emma, a psychology major with purple streaks in her black hair, had grown up in a military family but rebelled against what she saw as the authoritarian structure of her childhood. She'd chosen her university specifically because it was far from any military installations, and she'd spent 4 years trying to understand why anyone would voluntarily submit to such a rigid, hierarchical system. Tyler, the quietest of the group, was majoring in communications with dreams of becoming a documentary filmmaker. He'd been working on a project about the myth of the American hero, interviewing veterans and trying to understand what he saw as the disconnect between the reality of military service and the way it was portrayed in popular culture. These were intelligent, well-educated young people who had learned to question authority, challenge assumptions, and think critically about the world around them. Their professors had taught them to be skeptical of nationalism, to question the narratives that society used to justify its actions, and to recognize the ways that power structures maintained themselves through mythology and propaganda. In their minds, they were doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, questioning the glorification of military service, challenging the assumption that wearing a uniform automatically made someone a hero, and refusing to participate in what they saw as a culture of false worship. They had no way of knowing that the quiet woman in the corner booth, the one they'd so casually dismissed as seeking attention with her participation trophy, had lived through experiences that would have broken most people. They couldn't see the invisible scars that marked her body, the memories that haunted her dreams, or the weight of responsibility she carried for decisions made in moments when seconds meant the difference between life and death. In their comfortable world of academic theory and intellectual debate, war was an abstract concept, heroism was a social construct, and military service was a choice made by people who couldn't find better options. They'd never held a dying friend in their arms, never made split-second decisions that saved lives or cost them, never carried the weight of command when everything went wrong and someone had to take responsibility. The diner's atmosphere, usually warm and welcoming, had grown tense as the evening progressed. The regular customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to conflict in their peaceful gathering place. Dorothy Martinez wiped down the same section of counter 3 times, her movements sharp with barely contained irritation as she listened to the students' increasingly loud commentary. Old Pete Garrison gripped his coffee cup tighter, his knuckles white with the effort of staying seated. As a veteran himself, he'd recognized something in Victoria's bearing from the moment she'd first walked into the diner months ago. There was a stillness about her, a way of sitting that kept her back to the wall and her eyes on the exits, that spoke of training and experience that went far beyond what most people could imagine. The Morrison family had stopped their usual cheerful conversation, the teenage daughters looking uncertain as they picked up on the adults' tension. Sarah Chun had abandoned her grading entirely, her red pen forgotten as she watched the unfolding drama with growing concern. This was the world Victoria Thorne had chosen when she'd moved to Millbrook Falls, a place where she could blend in, where her past could remain private, where she could work her quiet job at the hardware store and eat her Tuesday dinners in peace. She'd thought she'd found a refuge from the weight of her memories, a place where she could simply be another face in the crowd. But the past had a way of following you, and sometimes the most innocent evening could become the stage for confrontations you never saw coming. The purple heart on her lapel wasn't just a decoration. It was a symbol of a night in Afghanistan when everything went wrong, when impossible choices had to be made, and when one person's courage under fire had saved an entire platoon while earning her a place in military history that she'd spent years trying to forget. The students had no idea that their casual mockery had just targeted a living legend. A woman whose actions had been studied in military academies around the world, whose name was spoken with reverence in circles they'd never imagined existed. But they were about to learn the difference between theory and reality, between academic understanding and lived experience, between questioning authority and disrespecting sacrifice. The quiet evening at the Copper Kettle Diner was about to become something none of them would ever forget. Victoria Thorne had never intended to become invisible, but somehow over the past 6 months in Millbrook Falls, that's exactly what had happened. She moved through her days like a shadow, arriving at Henderson's hardware store at precisely 7:30 each morning, organizing inventory with military precision, helping customers find what they needed with quiet efficiency, and leaving at exactly 4 o'clock without fanfare. Her apartment above Riverside Books was spartanly furnished, containing only what she needed and nothing more. A single bed with hospital corners, a small table with 1 chair, a reading lamp, and shelves lined with books about gardening, local history, and classic literature. No photographs adorned the walls, no personal mementos cluttered the surfaces. The only indication of her past was a locked wooden box hidden in her bedroom closet, containing medals, commendations, and documents she rarely allowed herself to look at. The people of Millbrook Falls knew her as a polite, reliable woman who kept to herself. At the hardware store, customers appreciated her uncanny ability to locate any item, no matter how obscure, and her practical knowledge about everything from plumbing repairs to electrical work. She never volunteered information about how she'd acquired such skills, and most people were too polite to ask. Old Pete Garrison had been the first to sense something different about her. During her second week in town, a customer had knocked over a display of paint cans, sending them crashing to the floor with a sound like gunfire. While everyone else had jumped or startled, Victoria had instantly dropped into a protective crouch, her eyes scanning for threats, her body coiled for action. The reaction had lasted only seconds before she'd caught herself, stood up, and calmly begun cleaning up the spilled paint as if nothing had happened. Pete had watched this exchange with knowing eyes. 40 years in the military, followed by 30. As a forest ranger had taught him to recognize certain signs, the way someone carried themselves, How they positioned their body in a room, the split-second reactions that revealed training that never truly left your system. He'd tried to engage her in conversation about service, but Victoria had politely deflected every attempt, changing the subject with practiced ease. Dorothy Martinez at the diner had her own observations. Victoria always chose the corner booth, the one that gave her a clear view of both the front door and the kitchen entrance. She never sat with her back to the room, never seemed fully relaxed even during her quietest moments. When the coffee shop across the street had experienced a small kitchen fire and the fire trucks had arrived with sirens blaring, Dorothy had watched Victoria's reaction through the diner window. While everyone else had rushed outside to see what was happening, Victoria had remained seated, tracking the emergency vehicles with the calm assessment of someone who'd seen real crises and knew how to evaluate actual threats. What the townspeople couldn't see were the nightmares that still woke her at 3 in the morning. The phantom pain in her left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone, or the way certain sounds, helicopter rotors, diesel engines, the hiss of pneumatic brakes, could transport her instantly back to places she'd rather forget. They didn't know about the prescription bottles hidden in her medicine cabinet, the ones that helped with pain management and sleep, or the carefully maintained exercise routine that kept both her body and mind functional. Victoria had chosen Millbrook Falls specifically because it was small enough that she could blend in but large enough that people respected privacy. She'd driven through dozens of similar towns during her cross-country journey after her medical retirement, looking for a place that felt safe, quiet, and blessedly ordinary. The mountain setting reminded her of some of the more peaceful moments during her deployments before everything had gone wrong, when she could still believe that her mission was making a difference. Her job at Henderson's hardware store was perfect for her needs. The work was physical enough to keep her busy, but not so demanding that it triggered her chronic pain. The customers were generally friendly but not intrusive, asking for help with their projects without prying into her personal life. The store's owner, Jack Henderson, was a kind man in his 70s who'd hired her based on her references without asking too many questions about the gaps in her employment history. The Purple Heart she wore wasn't her only decoration. It wasn't even her highest honor, but it was the one that felt most honest to display. The Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and the others remained locked away because they represented a version of herself she was still trying to understand. A person who'd made choices under impossible circumstances and somehow survived when others hadn't. She'd earned the Purple Heart during her 3rd deployment, on a night when her convoy had been ambushed 30 miles outside Kandahar. The improvised explosive device had flipped their vehicle, killing 2 of her soldiers instantly and leaving her pinned under twisted metal with a piece of shrapnel lodged dangerously close to her spine. For 6 hours, while insurgents fired sporadically at their position and rescue seemed impossible, she'd maintained command of her remaining troops, coordinated their defense, and somehow kept everyone alive until air support could reach them. The doctors had said she was lucky to walk again. The psychologists had said she was lucky to function again. The military had said she was a hero. Victoria felt none of these things. She felt tired, responsible for the 2 who hadn't made it home, and grateful for the chance to disappear into civilian life, where her biggest worry was whether the store had enough 3-inch screws in stock. Her daily routine in Millbrook Falls was carefully constructed to maintain equilibrium. Morning coffee at home while reading the local newspaper. Work at the hardware store, where she could help people solve concrete problems with tangible solutions. Lunch alone, usually a sandwich, from the deli counter at Morrison's Market. Afternoon work, organizing inventory and handling customer questions. Evening walks through the residential neighborhoods, where she could observe normal family life through lit windows, children doing homework, parents cooking dinner, televisions flickering with comedies and dramas that had nothing to do with life and death. Tuesday dinners at the Copper Kettle had become her one concession to social routine. Not because she particularly needed the company, but because Dorothy Martinez made excellent meatloaf and the diner's atmosphere reminded her of places from her childhood, before the military had redefined her understanding of normalcy. She always brought a book, always ordered the same meal, and always left a generous tip because she understood what it meant to work hard for modest pay. The Purple Heart pinned to her jacket wasn't displayed out of pride or a desire for recognition. She wore it because a veterans counselor at the VA hospital had suggested that acknowledging her service, even in small ways, might help with the adjustment to civilian life. You can't just pretend that part of yourself doesn't exist, the counselor had said. It's part of who you are, part of what brought you to this point. Hiding it completely might cause more psychological damage than processing it, so she'd compromised. One medal, worn quietly, not as a conversation starter, but as a personal reminder that she'd survived, that she'd served with honor, and that she deserved to build whatever kind of life she could manage in the aftermath. Most people in town had grown accustomed to seeing it and accepted it as simply part of who she was, the quiet woman who worked at the hardware store and minded her own business. She'd never expected to encounter the kind of casual cruelty she'd just experienced from the college students. In her years of service, she'd faced enemy fire, political complications, and the constant stress of making life and death decisions, but she'd never had to deal with young Americans mocking the symbol of sacrifice that other Americans had died earning. The disconnect was jarring, the casual dismissal of something so deeply significant, both painful and bewildering. Walking home through the cool October night, Victoria reflected on how completely her life had changed. 3 years ago, she'd commanded respect from generals and foreign dignitaries. Soldiers had saluted her, politicians had sought her counsel, and military historians had studied her tactical decisions. Now she was just another middle-aged woman working retail, trying to build a quiet life in a small town where her greatest ambition was to make it through each day, without triggering memories that could derail her carefully maintained stability. But some things she was about to discover couldn't stay buried forever. And some nights, the past had a way of catching up with the present in ways no one could anticipate. The next evening, Victoria entered the Copper Kettle at her usual time, hoping the previous night's encounter had been an isolated incident. The familiar warmth of the diner embraced her as Dorothy looked up from behind the counter with a concerned smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The regular customers were in their usual spots, Pete at his corner stool, the Morrisons in their family booth, Sarah Chun grading papers by the window. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, exactly as Victoria preferred it. But as she settled into her corner booth, and Dorothy brought her coffee without being asked, Victoria noticed something different in the atmosphere. Conversations were more subdued than usual, and several people glanced in her direction with expressions she couldn't quite read. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't the comfortable indifference she'd grown accustomed to either. "You okay, honey?" Dorothy asked quietly as she set down the steaming mug. "After last night, I mean. Those kids were way out of line." Victoria nodded, managing a small smile. "I'm fine, Dorothy. Thank you for asking." But she wasn't fine, and both women knew it. The casual cruelty of the college students had reopened wounds Victoria thought she'd successfully sealed. She'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, remembering not just the ambush in Afghanistan, but all the other moments when she'd been questioned, doubted, or dismissed simply because people couldn't see past their own assumptions. As if summoned by her darkest thoughts, the bell above the diner's front door chimed, and the same group of college students walked in. Victoria's stomach tightened as she recognized Brad's expensive sweater, Amber's deliberately provocative t-shirt, and Jake's intellectual smugness. They were back, apparently having enjoyed their previous evening's entertainment enough to return for an encore. This time, they didn't even pretend to be subtle. Brad pointed directly at Victoria as they claimed a booth near the center of the diner, his voice carrying clearly across the small space. "Look who's back," he announced to his friends with theatrical surprise. "Our local war hero with her shiny participation trophy." Amber giggled, the sound sharp and grating in the diner's usual quiet atmosphere. "I still can't believe she actually wears that thing in public. It's like she's desperately trying to get attention or sympathy or something." The regular customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Pete Garrison's jaw tightened visibly, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup with enough force to turn his knuckles white. The Morrison family's cheerful conversation died completely, the teenage daughters looking between their parents with confused expressions as they picked up on the adults' tension. Victoria kept her eyes fixed on her book, the same worn paperback. She'd been reading the night before, but the words blurred together as she struggled to maintain her composure. She'd faced down insurgents, navigated political minefields in foreign countries, and commanded respect in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. She would not be driven away from her sanctuary by a group of privileged children who had never faced real hardship. Jake leaned back in his booth, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone who believed his education made him an expert on subjects he'd only read about. "You know what really bothers me? It's this whole culture of military worship we've created. Like, just because someone puts on a uniform, we're supposed to automatically respect them, no questions asked." "Exactly," Emma chimed in, her psychology background evident in her analytical tone. "It's a form of social conditioning designed to prevent critical thinking about military actions. We're taught to see the uniform instead of questioning the person wearing it or the system they represent." Tyler, the communications major, nodded sagely while pulling out his phone to record what he apparently thought would be valuable footage for his documentary project. "This is perfect, actually. Look at how she's sitting there, practically displaying that medal like it's some kind of badge of honor. It's exactly the kind of performative patriotism I'm trying to expose in my film." Their voices grew louder and more confident as they fed off each other's agreement. What had started as casual conversation was becoming a public performance, a demonstration of their intellectual superiority and moral clarity for the benefit of anyone within earshot. Brad stood up, apparently deciding that sitting across the diner wasn't close enough for maximum impact. He walked over to Victoria's booth with the swagger of someone who'd never encountered real consequences for his actions, his friends following like an eager audience. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "My friends and I were just discussing military culture, and we couldn't help but notice your, decoration there. We're students at Clearwater University, and we're doing research on how military symbolism affects civilian spaces." Victoria looked up from her book, her gray eyes meeting his with a steadiness that should have warned him he was treading on dangerous ground. But Brad, intoxicated by his own perceived cleverness and the attention of his peers, pressed forward. "We're particularly interested in the psychological motivations behind displaying military honors in non-military settings," he continued, gesturing toward her Purple Heart. "Like what drives someone to wear something like that to a regular dinner? Is it about seeking validation, or is it more about maintaining an identity that might otherwise be forgotten?" The diner had gone completely silent now. Even the soft jazz playing from the overhead speakers seemed muted as every customer strained to hear the exchange. Dorothy had stopped pretending to clean glasses and stood frozen behind the counter, her face flushed with anger. She was struggling to contain. Victoria closed her book slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried an authority that cut through the college student's confident chatter like a blade. "I wear it," she said simply, "because I earned it." Amber laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "But that's exactly what we're talking about. This idea that military service automatically equals earning something meaningful. Like, what did you actually do? Sit on a base somewhere? File paperwork? Get a minor injury during training?" The Purple Heart, Jake added with the confidence of someone who'd read about military decorations online. Is basically the military's way of giving everyone a trophy. It's awarded for any injury, no matter how minor, sustained in what they call combat. But we all know that combat these days mostly means sitting in fortified compounds, while drone operators do the actual fighting. Tyler continued recording, his phone capturing what he believed would be compelling footage of ordinary citizens challenging military mythology. This is exactly the kind of unexamined hero worship that perpetuates the military-industrial complex, he narrated quietly. Into his device, Victoria's hands remained steady on her book. But those who knew what to look for could see the subtle signs of a warrior preparing for battle, the slight straightening of her shoulders, the way her breathing became more controlled, the almost imperceptible shift in her posture that suggested coiled energy ready to spring into action. Emma, emboldened by her friend's support and convinced of her own psychological insight, leaned forward with what she probably thought was compassionate concern. Look, we're not trying to be mean here. We're just trying to understand why someone would choose to define themselves by what's essentially a participation trophy from an organization that profits from global conflict. Right, Brad added, warming to his theme. I mean, real heroes don't need to advertise it, you know? They don't walk around wearing their accomplishments like jewelry. It just seems kind of desperate, like you're trying to get special treatment. Or something. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Victoria had endured their ignorance, their casual cruelty, and their smug assumptions. But this final assault on her character, her service, and the sacrifice that metal represented, pushed her past the point of polite tolerance. She stood up. Slowly, her full height revealing a presence that had been hidden by her seated position. There was something in her bearing now, a barely contained power that made the college students take an unconscious step backward. For the first time since they'd begun their performance, doubt flickered in their confident expressions. But before Victoria could respond, before she could find words adequate to address their ignorance without revealing more about herself than she was prepared to share, her phone rang. The sound cut through the tension like a lifeline, offering her a moment to step back from a confrontation that could only end badly for everyone involved. She glanced at the caller ID and froze. The number was one she recognized, one she'd hoped never to see again. It was a number that could only mean one thing, that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to be shattered by forces beyond her control. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil now raging inside her. "I need to take this." The college students exchanged triumphant glances, interpreting her withdrawal as victory in their intellectual battle. They had no way of knowing that the phone call Victoria was about to answer would transform their evening of casual cruelty into a lesson about the difference between academic theory and lived reality, between questioning authority and disrespecting sacrifice. The past, which Victoria had worked so hard to keep buried, was about to explode into the present with the force of an artillery shell, and nothing in the Copper Kettle Diner would ever be quite the same again. Victoria stepped outside, into the cool mountain air, her phone pressed to her ear as she answered the call that had interrupted the confrontation inside. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Rebecca Hayes from the Pentagon's Military Personnel Division, someone Victoria hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. "Victoria, I apologize for calling during your personal time, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," Colonel Hayes said without preamble. "There's been a security breach involving classified information about Operation Mountain Shield. Your testimony may be needed for the investigation." Victoria's blood ran cold. Operation Mountain Shield was the mission where she'd earned her Purple Heart, the night that had changed everything. "I thought that was sealed permanently," she said quietly, glancing back at the diner's windows where she could see the college students celebrating what they believed was their victory. It was, but circumstances have changed. I can't discuss details over an unsecured line, but I need to know if you're available for a classified briefing tomorrow morning. A car will pick you up at 0600 hours. I understand, Victoria replied, her military training automatically reasserting itself. I'll be ready. And Victoria, this is extremely sensitive. The operation you commanded has implications that go far beyond what's in your official record. We may need you to consider returning to active consultation status. The call ended, leaving Victoria staring at her phone with trembling hands. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her civilian life were crumbling, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to rebuild them again. After a few moments to compose herself, she walked back into the diner, hoping to collect her things and leave quietly, but as she approached her booth, she discovered that the situation had deteriorated even further in her absence. A new voice had joined the conversation, one that made her stomach sink with recognition and dread. Professor Malcolm Hartwell from Clearwater University stood beside the student's booth, his distinguished gray beard and tweed jacket giving him an air of academic authority that the young people clearly revered. Victoria knew him by reputation. He was a prominent peace studies professor who had written extensively about what he called the mythology of American militarism. His books were bestsellers in certain circles, and his lectures drew standing room only. Crowds of students eager to have their anti-establishment views validated by someone with impressive credentials. This is exactly what I've been talking about in my lectures, Professor Hartwell was saying, his cultured voice carrying easily across the diner. The way military symbolism invades civilian spaces as a form of psychological manipulation. Look at how that woman displays her medal. It's designed to shut down rational discourse and make any criticism of military policy seem unpatriotic. Brad and his friends hung on every word, clearly thrilled to have such a distinguished ally join their cause. Professor Hartwell, this is perfect timing, Brad said excitedly. We were just discussing the performative nature of military honor displays with that woman over there. The professor turned to look at Victoria with the clinical detachment of someone studying a specimen. Ah yes, the Purple Heart. Classic example of participation trophy culture within the military-industrial complex. These decorations are handed out so liberally that they've lost any meaningful significance. Victoria felt the familiar weight of exhaustion that came with being constantly misunderstood and underestimated. She'd faced this kind of academic dismissal before, usually from people who had never been closer to actual conflict than their university libraries. But tonight, after the phone call from Colonel Hayes and the stress of the past 2 days, her patience was wearing dangerously thin. Jake pulled out his phone to capture Professor Hartwell's wisdom for his documentary. Could you explain more about how these military symbols function as propaganda tools? Certainly, the professor replied, warming to his favorite subject. The Purple Heart, despite its dramatic name, is awarded for virtually any injury sustained in a combat zone, regardless of how minor or even self-inflicted. It's a way of creating artificial heroes to justify military spending and foreign interventions. Amber nodded eagerly. We were trying to explain that to her, but she seemed really defensive about it, like she couldn't handle having her beliefs challenged. Professor Hartwell chuckled condescendingly. That's typical of military mindset. They're trained to follow orders without question, so intellectual discourse becomes threatening to their worldview. The medal becomes a shield against critical thinking. Emma leaned forward with the intensity of someone receiving profound wisdom. In your book, Manufacturing Heroes, you wrote about how military decorations serve the same function as religious relics in maintaining social control. Could you elaborate on that? Precisely, the professor said, clearly pleased to have such an attentive audience. These symbols function as totems, creating an artificial sense of the sacred around what are essentially political decisions. The person wearing that medal has been conditioned to see herself as part of something greater, when in reality she's just a tool of corporate and political interests. Tyler continued recording, his excitement barely contained. This is incredible. Footage. Professor, would you be willing to do an interview for my documentary about military mythology and American culture? I'd be delighted, Professor Hartwell replied. In fact, this situation presents a perfect case study. Here we have someone displaying military symbolism in a civilian space, surrounded by people who feel compelled to show deference purely because of that symbol's presence. Victoria had heard enough. She stood up slowly, her movement causing the entire group to turn in her direction. Professor Hartwell regarded her with the slightly pitying expression of someone who believed he understood her psychology better than she understood it herself. "Excuse me," she said quietly, approaching their booth with the measured steps of someone who had learned to control her emotions under the most extreme circumstances. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about military decorations." "Professor." Hartwell smiled with the patient condescension of someone who dealt with challenging students on a daily basis. "Of course, my dear. I hope you don't mind our academic discourse. We're simply engaging in the kind of critical analysis that's essential for a healthy democracy." "I understand," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. "But I think there might be some misconceptions in your analysis." Brad snorted with amusement. "Here we go. Time for the 'you don't understand what it's really like' speech." "Actually," Professor Hartwell interjected, raising a hand to silence his student, "I'd be very interested to hear your perspective. As someone who's been directly affected by military conditioning, your viewpoint could provide valuable insight into how these psychological mechanisms operate on the individual level." The professor's tone was that of a researcher speaking to a test subject, someone whose experiences were interesting primarily as data points to support his predetermined conclusions. He had no intention of actually listening to what Victoria might say. He was simply gathering material to reinforce his existing theories. "The Purple Heart," Victoria said carefully, "is awarded to service members who are wounded or killed in action against an enemy of the United States. It's not given for training injuries or accidents." Professor Hartwell nodded with the patronizing patience of someone humoring a child's misconception. "That's the official definition, yes, but in practice, the standards have been significantly lowered. Modern warfare creates very broad interpretations of what constitutes enemy action or legitimate wounds." Amber jumped in eagerly. "Plus, even if you did get hurt somehow, that doesn't automatically make you a hero, right? Soldiers sign up knowing there's risk involved. Why should we treat them like they're special just for doing the job they volunteered for?" "An excellent point," Professor Hartwell agreed. "The hero narrative serves specific political functions, but it doesn't reflect the reality of modern military service, which is largely administrative and logistical work performed in relatively safe environments." Jake nodded sagely. "Right. And the whole supporting the troops thing is really just supporting the policies that put them in harm's way. If we really cared about soldiers, we'd question the wars they're sent to fight instead of just blindly thanking them for their service." Emma added her psychological perspective. "It's actually kind of cruel when you think about it. We create this mythology around military service that makes it harder for veterans to admit when they're struggling or when their experiences don't match the heroic narrative society expects." Professor Hartwell beamed at his students like a proud parent. "You see how quickly critical thinking can cut through propaganda? These young people understand that true patriotism means questioning authority, not blindly accepting military mythology." Victoria felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd endured personal attacks, casual cruelty, and academic dismissal, but this systematic deconstruction of everything she and her fallen comrades had sacrificed for was pushing her toward a breaking point she hadn't experienced since her darkest days in the hospital. "Professor," she said, her voice still controlled, but carrying an edge that should have warned anyone with combat experience. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's life depended on your decisions? The professor's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. That's exactly the kind of false binary thinking the military promotes. The idea that only people who've experienced violence can have valid opinions about it is anti-intellectual and anti-democratic. It's like saying only criminals can have opinions about crime, Brad added helpfully. Just because you haven't done something doesn't mean you can't understand it or critique it. Tyler continued recording, sensing that this exchange was building toward something significant for his documentary. "This is perfect," he murmured to his camera. "Real-time deconstruction of military mythology." Professor Hartwell leaned back in his booth, clearly enjoying what he saw as an intellectual victory. "My dear, I've spent 30 years studying military culture, reading classified documents, interviewing veterans, and analyzing the psychological and political mechanisms of warfare. I understand these systems far better than most of the people trapped within them." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down and saw it was from Colonel Hayes. Situation more urgent than initially briefed. 4-star General. Morrison will be personally overseeing the investigation. He specifically requested to meet with you, General Morrison. Victoria's hands went numb. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years, but it still had the power to stop her. Heart. If General Morrison was involved, this wasn't just about Operation Mountain Shield anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could change everything. The college students and their professor had no idea that their evening of intellectual superiority was about to collide with forces beyond their comprehension. The quiet woman they'd been dismissing as a victim of military propaganda was about to receive visitors who would redefine their understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and the true cost of the freedom they took for granted. The atmosphere in the Copper Kettle had shifted from uncomfortable tension to something approaching a feeding frenzy. Word of the confrontation had somehow spread, and more Clearwater University students began filtering into the diner, drawn by social media posts and text messages about the epic takedown happening in the small mountain town. What had started as 5 college students challenging one quiet woman had grown into a crowd of nearly 20 young people, all eager to participate in what they saw as an important intellectual victory. Professor Hartwell had essentially turned the diner into an impromptu lecture hall, holding court from his booth while students gathered around him in a semicircle. The regular customers of the Copper Kettle found themselves unwilling witnesses to what felt like a public execution by academic theory. This is precisely what I mean when I talk about the militarization of civilian discourse, Professor Hartwell continued, gesturing toward Victoria as if she were a visual aid rather than a human being. Notice how the mere presence of military symbolism changes the entire dynamic of this space. People feel compelled to whisper, to show deference, to avoid challenging questions that in any other context would be considered perfectly reasonable. A new student, a young woman with bright pink hair and multiple facial piercings who had just arrived, raised her hand eagerly. "Professor Hartwell, is this an example of what you call manufactured consent through symbolic intimidation?" "Excellent question, Lindsay," the professor beamed. "Yes, this is a textbook case. The Purple Heart functions as a conversation stopper, a way of shutting down legitimate criticism of military policy by invoking personal sacrifice. It's emotionally manipulative and intellectually dishonest." Brad, emboldened by his professor's presence and the growing audience, stood up and addressed the room like a prosecutor making his closing argument. "Look, we're not trying to be cruel here. We're just pointing out that wearing military decorations in civilian settings is a form of attention-seeking behavior. It's like wearing your high school letterman jacket to a job interview. It shows you're stuck in the past and can't move on with your life." The crowd of students erupted in appreciative laughter and applause. Several pulled out their phones to record what they clearly believed was a brilliant analogy. Tyler continued his documentary filming, now with multiple angles as other students. Joined in the recording. Emma stepped forward, her psychology background lending authority to her analysis. From a therapeutic perspective, this kind of public display of military identity often indicates an inability to process trauma in healthy ways. Instead of seeking professional help, veterans sometimes cling to their service identity because it's the only thing that makes them feel valuable. That's actually really sad when you think about it, added a new voice. Madison Carter, a senior sociology major, had just arrived and was quickly catching up on the situation. Like, imagine being so defined by one period of your life that you can't function without constantly reminding everyone about it. Professor Hartwell nodded approvingly. Madison raises an important point about the psychological damage that military culture inflicts on its own members. The rigid hierarchy, the emphasis on unquestioning obedience, the artificial creation of group identity through shared trauma. These are all techniques borrowed from cult indoctrination. Jake had his laptop open now, live streaming the event. To his social media followers, "This is incredible, guys. We're witnessing real-time deconstruction of military propaganda. Professor Hartwell is literally explaining how the system brainwashes people while we watch someone who's been brainwashed try to defend her programming." Victoria remained standing beside her booth, surrounded but not retreating. Every instinct, trained into her during years of combat, told her to either fight or withdraw. But she found herself frozen in a kind of horrified fascination at the depths of ignorance and cruelty being displayed by people who considered themselves enlightened and compassionate. Amber had positioned herself directly in front of Victoria, close enough to be intentionally intimidating. "I mean, seriously, what do you think you're proving by wearing that thing? Do you think it makes you special? Do you think it entitles you to respect you haven't earned in civilian life?" "Right," chimed in another new arrival, a philosophy major named Derek, who specialized in what he called deconstructive ethics. The whole concept of military honor is based on tribalistic thinking. Just because you were willing to use violence on behalf of the state doesn't make you morally superior to people who choose nonviolent approaches to conflict resolution. Professor Hartwell leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a profound insight. "You see, class, this is why critical thinking is so threatening to military culture. The moment you start asking logical questions about the purpose and effectiveness of military action, the whole mythology begins to crumble." Tyler zoomed in on Victoria's face with his camera. Look at her expression. You can literally see the cognitive dissonance happening in real time. Her programming is telling her that her service was meaningful and heroic, but logic is forcing her to confront the reality that she was just a tool of corporate and political interests. The crowd pressed closer, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of academic jargon and moral superiority. Victoria felt the walls of the diner closing in around her, the familiar sensation of being trapped that she'd experienced in the overturned vehicle in Afghanistan. But this was different. This wasn't enemy fire or life-threatening injury. This was something more insidious and harder to fight. The systematic destruction of everything she'd believed about service, sacrifice, and the meaning of her own life. Lindsay, the pink-haired student, pulled out her phone and began recording a selfie video with Victoria in the background. "So I'm here at this random diner where Professor Hartwell is completely destroying this old veteran's worldview. She's literally just standing there while he explains how she's been brainwashed by military propaganda. It's kind of painful to watch, but also really educational." Madison stepped closer to Victoria, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone offering unwanted therapy. "Look, I know this is probably hard to hear, but maybe this is actually a good thing for you. Maybe it's time to move past this military identity and figure out who you really are without the uniform and the medals." "Yeah," Brad added, his confidence reaching new heights with each supportive nod from his peers. You could probably benefit from some counseling to help you process whatever trauma convinced you that your worth as a person is tied to your military service. There's no shame in admitting you need help, Derek nodded sagely. It's actually kind of brave that you're here listening to this instead of running away. Most people who've been indoctrinated by authoritarian systems can't handle having their beliefs challenged so directly. Professor Hartwell raised his hand for attention, clearly preparing to deliver what he considered a coup de grace. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here is the collision between mythology and reality, between propaganda and truth. This woman has been conditioned to believe that her Purple Heart represents something noble and significant, but we can see through rational analysis that it's simply a token designed to create artificial meaning around participation in a fundamentally immoral system. The students erupted in applause, their phones capturing what they believed was a moment of intellectual triumph. Several began posting to social media immediately, using hashtags like #MilitaryMyth, #CriticalThinking, #PeaceStudies, #DeconstructingPropan. Emma stepped forward with what she clearly thought was compassionate concern. I want you to know that this isn't personal. We're not attacking you as an individual. We're just trying to help you understand how the system has manipulated your perception of your own experiences. Exactly, Amber agreed. Once you let go of this artificial identity that's been imposed on you, you might actually find some peace. You won't have to carry around the weight of pretending that whatever you did overseas was meaningful or important. Jake paused his live stream to address Victoria directly. For my documentary, would you be willing to talk about what it feels like to have your military mythology challenged by facts and logic? I think it would be really powerful to show the process of someone beginning to question their conditioning. The circle of students tightened around Victoria, their voices becoming a blur of academic terminology and moral judgment. Words like propaganda, brainwashing, mythology, and indoctrination flew through the air like shrapnel, each one designed to strip away another layer of meaning from her service and sacrifice. Victoria's vision began to tunnel, the familiar symptoms of a panic attack beginning to build in her chest. The faces around her blurred together into a hostile crowd, their voices echoing with the certainty of people who had never been tested by real crisis, never faced choices where every option led to loss, never carried the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. But just as the walls seemed to be closing in completely, just as Victoria felt herself beginning to crack under the sustained assault on everything she'd given her life to defend, her phone rang again. The sound cut through the crowd's chatter like a gunshot, causing several students to jump and step back instinctively. Victoria looked at the caller ID and felt her world shift on its axis. The call was coming from a number she recognized, one she'd hoped never to see again, but had always known might someday appear. It was a number that could only mean one thing, that the carefully buried past was about to explode into the present with the force of a direct artillery hit. The students had no idea that their evening of intellectual superiority was about to become a lesson in the difference between theory and reality, between academic understanding and lived truth. The quiet woman they'd been systematically destroying was about to receive a call that would change everything they thought they knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria smiled. Victoria answered the phone with steady hands despite the chaos surrounding her, her voice automatically shifting to the crisp, professional tone that years of military service had ingrained into her very bones. "Colonel Thorne," she said, using her retired rank instinctively as she recognized the Pentagon's secure communication system. The voice on the other end belonged to General Patricia Morrison herself, the four-star general whose name had appeared in the earlier text message. Victoria's breath caught. General Morrison wasn't just any senior officer. She was the highest-ranking female combat veteran in the United States military. a legend whose strategic brilliance had shaped modern warfare doctrine. Victoria, this is General Morrison. I apologize for the short notice, but we have a situation that requires your immediate expertise. Are you secure to talk? Victoria glanced around at the crowd of college students, all of whom had fallen silent. At her sudden transformation from victim to someone clearly speaking with serious authority. I'm in a public location, ma'am. Mixed company. Understood. I'm going to put you on speaker with Colonel Hayes and General Rodriguez from Special Operations Command. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels, but circumstances have made immediate action necessary. The students exchanged confused glances. Professor Hartwell's confident expression began to waver as he tried to process what he was witnessing. The woman they'd been systematically humiliating was apparently important, enough to receive direct calls from the Pentagon's senior leadership. Victoria, General Morrison continued, her voice carrying the weight of ultimate military authority. 3 hours ago, we intercepted intelligence indicating that a major terrorist cell has been planning an attack on American soil. The operation they're planning is identical to the one you disrupted in Afghanistan during Operation Mountain Shield. Victoria's face went pale. Operation Mountain Shield wasn't just the mission where she'd earned her Purple Heart, it was a classified operation that had prevented a catastrophic attack on NATO forces. The tactical innovations she'd developed during that mission had been studied and implemented across multiple theaters of operation, saving thousands of lives. Ma'am, I thought that intelligence was permanently sealed, Victoria said, her military bearing becoming more pronounced with each word. It was until today. The terrorist cell somehow obtained detailed information about your tactics and countermeasures. They're planning to use that knowledge to overcome the defensive strategies you developed. We need you back, Victoria. Not as a consultant, as an active commander. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the students who had been live streaming moments before now stood frozen, their phones forgotten as they tried to comprehend what they were witnessing. Colonel Hayes's voice joined the conversation. Victoria, the President has been briefed on the situation. She's prepared to offer you a direct commission at the rank of Brigadier General, with full command authority over a joint task force. This isn't a request, it's a matter of national security. Brad, who moments before had been mocking Victoria's participation trophy, now stood slack-jawed as he realized he'd been insulting someone who apparently had direct access to the highest levels of government. His expensive sweater suddenly seemed trivial compared to the conversation unfolding before him. The attack is planned for tomorrow night, General Morrison continued. The target is a major civilian population center. Based on the intelligence we've gathered, the only person who has both the tactical knowledge and combat experience to stop this is you. Your innovations during Mountain Shield are literally the only reason we know how to counter this type of operation. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. What's the timeline, ma'am? A helicopter will be at the Millbrook Falls Municipal Airfield in 30 minutes. You'll be briefed en route to Peterson Air Force Base, then transported to the operational theater. Victoria, I know what we're asking of you. I know the cost of what you've already given. But there are lives at stake, potentially thousands of them. Professor Hartwell, who had spent the evening lecturing about military mythology and manufactured heroism, now found himself face to face with the reality of what military service actually meant. The woman he'd dismissed as a victim of propaganda was apparently one of the military's most valuable strategic assets. Emma, the psychology major who had offered to help Victoria process her trauma, stared in horror as she began to understand the magnitude of what she'd been saying. The artificial identity and programming she'd been mocking were apparently real, qualifications at the highest levels of government considered essential for national defense. Ma'am, Victoria said into the phone, I need to clarify something. For my own peace of mind. The Purple Heart I received during Mountain Shield. The citation mentioned saving 47 civilian lives. Was that number accurate? There was a pause before General Morrison replied, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the whispered conversations among the students. Victoria, the official citation was classified and redacted for security reasons. The actual number of lives you saved that night was 2,347. Your tactical decisions prevented a coordinated attack on a refugee camp. If you hadn't held that position for 6 hours while wounded, if you hadn't developed the defensive countermeasures under enemy fire, those people would have died. The number hit the diner like a physical blow. Jake's live stream, which was still running, captured the moment when 20 college students realized they'd spent the evening mocking someone who had single-handedly prevented a massacre. Tyler lowered his camera, his documentary project suddenly seeming grotesquely inappropriate. Madison covered her mouth with her hands, her earlier comments about Victoria seeking attention now ringing in her ears like accusations against her own character. Additionally, General Rodriguez's voice joined the conversation. The tactical manual you wrote based on the Mountain Shield operation has been implemented in 17 different combat zones. Conservative estimates suggest your strategic innovations have saved over 10,000 military and civilian lives in the past 3 years. Professor Hartwell sank into his booth, his face ashen. His life's work had been built on the premise that military heroism was manufactured propaganda, but he was listening to evidence of genuine heroism that defied every theory he'd ever published. Amber, who had been standing closest to Victoria during the confrontation, took several steps backward, suddenly terrified that her proximity to such obvious importance might somehow implicate her in the evening's cruelty. Victoria, General Morrison continued, I need your answer. Will you accept the commission and command the task force? Victoria looked around the diner at the faces of the people who had spent the evening systematically destroying her sense of self-worth. The regular customers, Pete, Dorothy, the Morrison family, Sarah Chen, watched with expressions of awe and vindication. The college students stared with horror, shame, and dawning comprehension of what they'd done. Ma'am, there's one more thing I need to know, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of the past 2 hours. The soldiers who died during Mountain Shield, Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Washington, have their families been properly taken care of? Their families receive full benefits and honors. Sergeant Rodriguez's daughter is attending West Point on a full scholarship established in his honor. Corporal Washington's son graduated from MIT last year with a degree in engineering. He's now working on defense technology to protect future soldiers. Victoria nodded, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. Then yes, ma'am, I accept the commission. Outstanding. The helicopter is inbound. Victoria, there's something else you should know. The President specifically requested that this operation be named in honor of the soldiers who didn't make it home from Mountain Shield. The mission designation is Operation Rodriguez Washington. The call ended, leaving Victoria standing in the center of a completely transformed diner. The college students who had arrived expecting to witness an intellectual victory over military propaganda now found themselves spectators to a real-time demonstration of what actual heroism looked like when the stakes were life and death. Outside, the distant sound of rotor blades began to echo off the mountain walls, growing steadily louder as it approached the small town that would never be quite the same after this night. Victoria walked calmly to her booth, gathered her book and purse, and left money on the table for her untouched meal. As she headed toward the door, she paused beside Professor Hartwell's booth. Professor, she said quietly, I hope your students learned something valuable tonight. Sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom. Then she walked out into the Colorado night to meet the helicopter that would carry her back to a world where words mattered less than actions, where theories were tested by reality, and where the true cost of freedom was measured not in academic papers but in blood, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand between civilization and chaos. The students watched through the diner's windows as military lights appeared in the sky above Millbrook Falls, coming to collect a hero they had never recognized, had never understood, and would never forget. Victoria stepped out of the Copper Kettle Diner into the crisp mountain air, the sound of approaching rotor blades growing steadily louder against the backdrop of Millbrook Falls' quiet evening. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the town's main street, its beam cutting through the darkness like a sword, transforming the sleepy mountain community into something resembling a military operation. Inside the diner, the college students remained frozen in various states of shock and disbelief. The phones that had been eagerly recording their intellectual triumph now felt heavy and incriminating in their hands. Jake's live stream continued running, broadcasting their stunned silence to an audience that was rapidly growing as news of the confrontation spread across social media platforms. Professor Hartwell sat motionless in his booth, his mind struggling to reconcile 30 years of academic theory with the reality he'd just witnessed. The woman he'd spent the evening dismissing as a victim of military propaganda had just received a direct call from the Pentagon's highest leadership, been offered a general's commission by the president herself, and revealed to be responsible for saving thousands of lives through tactical innovations that were apparently studied in military academies worldwide. Dorothy Martinez stood behind the counter, her face flushed with a mixture of vindication and anger as she watched through the window. She'd known there was something special about Victoria from the beginning, something that went far beyond the quiet woman who organized hardware store inventory and ate solitary dinners on Tuesday nights. The respect she'd always sensed was deserved had just been revealed to be a massive understatement. Pete Garrison rose slowly from his corner stool, his weathered face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. As a veteran himself, he'd recognized the signs of someone who'd seen real combat, but even his experienced eye hadn't detected the magnitude of Victoria's service record. The woman he'd tried unsuccessfully to engage in conversations about military service was apparently a living legend whose exploits would be studied for generations. Outside, the helicopter circled the municipal airfield once before beginning its descent. The aircraft was a Black Hawk with military markings that most civilians wouldn't recognize, but Pete's trained eye immediately identified it as belonging to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the military's most elite helicopter unit. They didn't dispatch Night Stalkers for routine personnel transport. Sarah Chun gathered her papers with trembling hands, her red pen forgotten as she tried to process what she'd witnessed. As the town librarian, she'd always prided herself on being able to assess people accurately, to understand their stories from careful observation. But Victoria Thorne had been living in her community for 6 months, and Sarah had completely missed the fact that she was sharing her quiet mountain town with someone whose name was apparently spoken with reverence in the highest circles of military leadership. The Morrison family sat in stunned silence, their teenage daughters wide-eyed with the realization that the polite woman who'd helped them select the right screws for their deck project was the same person the President of the United States had just personally commissioned as a general. Jim Morrison found himself thinking about all the times he'd seen Victoria at the hardware store, how she'd always seemed to know exactly where everything was located, how she could solve any mechanical problem with quiet efficiency. Those skills, he now realized, had been honed in circumstances he couldn't begin to imagine. Inside the diner, Brad Westfield stared at his phone screen, watching the replay of his own words from just minutes earlier. What exactly did you do to earn that shiny medal, paper cut, hang nail? The cruelty of his comments now seemed monstrous in light of what they'd learned. The woman he'd mocked for wearing a participation trophy had apparently earned her decoration by preventing a massacre while wounded and under enemy fire for 6 hours. Amber. Rodriguez felt physically sick as she remembered her own contribution to the evening's cruelty. "That old medal doesn't make you special," she'd said, pointing at the purple heart that represented sacrifices she was only now beginning to comprehend. The medal she dismissed as meaningless attention-seeking was apparently a symbol of heroism that had saved over 2,000 lives in a single night. Emma Sinclair, the psychology major who'd offered to help Victoria process her trauma and move past her artificial military identity, now sat with her head in her hands. Her therapeutic insights about Victoria's need for counseling and inability to function without military symbolism had just been revealed as grotesquely inappropriate assumptions about someone whose psychological strength had enabled her to function as a strategic asset for the United States military. Tyler Brooks continued recording automatically, his documentary about military mythology taking an unexpected turn that would require him to completely reconsider his thesis. The footage he'd captured wasn't evidence of propaganda and manufactured heroism. It was documentation of genuine heroism being systematically attacked by people who had no framework for understanding what they were witnessing. Through the diner's front windows, the students watched through the diner's windows as military lights appeared in the sky above Millbrook Falls, coming to collect a hero they had never recognized, had never understood, and would never forget. Victoria stepped out of the Copper Kettle Diner into the crisp mountain air, the sound of approaching rotor blades growing steadily louder against the backdrop of Millbrook Falls' quiet evening. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the town's main street, its beam cutting through the darkness like a sword, transforming the sleepy mountain community into something resembling a military operation. Inside the diner, the college students remained frozen in various states of shock and disbelief. The phones that had been eagerly recording their intellectual triumph now felt heavy and incriminating in their hands. Jake's live stream continued running, broadcasting their stunned silence to an audience that was rapidly growing as news of the confrontation spread across social media platforms. Professor Hartwell sat motionless in his booth, his mind struggling to reconcile 30 years of academic theory with the reality he'd just witnessed. The woman he'd spent the evening dismissing as a victim of military propaganda had just received a direct call from the Pentagon's highest leadership, been offered a general's commission by the president herself, and revealed to be responsible for saving thousands of lives through tactical innovations that were apparently studied in military academies worldwide. Dorothy Martinez stood behind the counter, her face flushed with a mixture of vindication and anger as she watched through the window. She'd known there was something special about Victoria from the beginning, something that went far beyond the quiet woman who organized hardware store inventory and ate solitary dinners on Tuesday nights. The respect she'd always sensed was deserved had just been revealed to be a massive understatement. Pete Garrison rose slowly from his corner stool, his weathered face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. As a veteran himself, he'd recognized the signs of someone who'd seen real combat, but even his experienced eye hadn't detected the magnitude of Victoria's service record. The woman he'd tried unsuccessfully to engage in conversations about military service was apparently a living legend whose exploits would be studied for generations. Outside, the helicopter circled the municipal airfield once before beginning its descent. The aircraft was a Black Hawk with military markings that most civilians wouldn't recognize, but Pete's trained eye immediately identified it as belonging to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the military's most elite helicopter unit. They didn't dispatch Night Stalkers for routine personnel transport. Sarah Chun gathered her papers with trembling hands, her red pen forgotten as she tried to process what she'd witnessed. As the town librarian, she'd always prided herself on being able to assess people accurately, to understand their stories from careful observation. But Victoria Thorne had been living in her community for 6 months, and Sarah had completely missed the fact that she was sharing her quiet mountain town with someone whose name was apparently spoken with reverence in the highest circles of military leadership. The Morrison family sat in stunned silence, their teenage daughters wide-eyed with the realization that the polite woman who'd helped them select the right screws for their deck project was the same person the President of the United States had just personally commissioned as a general. Jim Morrison found himself thinking about all the times he'd seen Victoria at the hardware store, how she'd always seemed to know exactly where everything was located, how she could solve any mechanical problem with quiet efficiency. Those skills, he now realized, had been honed in circumstances he couldn't begin to imagine. Inside the diner, Brad Westfield stared at his phone screen, watching the replay of his own. Outside, Victoria stood waiting with the composed bearing of someone prepared to answer her country's call once again, regardless of the personal cost. The transformation was complete. The hardware store employee was gone, replaced by the strategic asset the military desperately needed. The generals were about to enter the Copper Kettle Diner, and nothing would ever be the same again. The three generals entered the Copper Kettle Diner with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention from every person in the room. Their uniforms were immaculate, their bearing unmistakably that of combat veterans who had earned their stars through decades of service in the world's most dangerous places. The lead officer, a tall African-American woman with 4 stars on her shoulders, surveyed the room with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly and accurately. General Patricia Morrison was a legend in military circles, the first female 4-star general to have commanded combat operations in 3 different theaters of war. Her tactical brilliance had been studied at West Point for over a decade, and her leadership during the Battle of Kalai Jangi had become required reading for every officer candidate in the United States military. She was followed by General Roberto Rodriguez, a 3-star with the Special Operations Command, whose scarred hands and weathered face told stories of missions that would never appear in any public record. The 3rd officer was General Sarah Kim, a 2-star intelligence specialist, whose work in counterterrorism had prevented attacks that the public would never know had been planned. These were not politicians or bureaucrats. These were warriors who had earned their rank through blood, sweat, and the kind of decisions that kept civilized society functioning while most people slept peacefully in their beds. General Morrison's gaze swept across the diner, taking in the terrified faces of the college students, the phone still recording, the social media posts visible on multiple screens, and the elderly veterans who had risen to their feet in automatic respect. Her expression remained neutral, but those who knew how to read military bearing could see the controlled anger building behind her professional demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from commanding respect in rooms full of world leaders, "I am General Patricia Morrison, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are General Rodriguez and General Kim. We are here to collect Colonel Victoria Thorne for immediate deployment on a matter of national security." The college students found themselves unable to move, pinned in place by the sheer presence of military authority they had never encountered before. Professor Hartwell, who had spent the evening lecturing about the mythology of military heroism, now faced 3 living examples of why that heroism was neither mythological nor manufactured. General Rodriguez stepped forward, his eyes moving methodically across the faces of the students who had been so confident in their moral superiority just minutes before. "I understand there has been some discussion this evening about military decorations and their significance. Specifically, I'm told there were questions raised about the Purple Heart worn by Colonel Thorne." Brad Westfield felt his legs go weak as the 3-star general's attention focused on him. The man standing before him had the kind of presence that made Brad's expensive education and privileged background seem like children's toys in comparison. General Rodriguez had commanded operations that had shaped the course of modern warfare, and his very existence seemed to invalidate every assumption Brad had made about military service. I want to make something clear to everyone in this room. General Morrison continued, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the diner. Colonel Victoria Thorne is one of the most decorated female combat veterans in United States military history. Her tactical innovations have been implemented across 17 different theaters of operation. Conservative estimates suggest that her strategic contributions have saved over 15,000 military and civilian lives. Amber Rodriguez felt physically ill as the magnitude of her evening's cruelty began to sink in. She had mocked a woman who had saved 15,000 lives, dismissed her as seeking attention with a participation trophy, and suggested that her military service was meaningless. The general standing before her represented a level of reality she had never considered. A world where decisions had consequences measured in human lives rather than academic grades. General Kim opened a tablet and began reading from what was clearly an official document. Colonel Thorne's service record includes 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Purple Heart currently in question. She has commanded operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Her tactical manual on urban counterinsurgency operations is required reading at every major military academy in the Western world. Emma Sinclair, who had offered to help Victoria process her trauma and move past her artificial military identity, now realized that she had been lecturing someone whose psychological strength had enabled her to function at the highest levels of military command while saving thousands of lives. The therapeutic insights she had so confidently offered were revealed as the presumptuous assumptions of someone who had never faced real adversity. Professor Hartwell tried to find his voice, but the words that had flowed so easily when he was deconstructing military mythology now seemed to stick in his throat. The 3 generals before him represented everything his academic theories had attempted to dismiss as propaganda. But their presence was undeniably real, their authority unquestionably earned, and their existence a direct challenge to every premise upon which he had built his career. I'm also told, General Morrison continued, that there were suggestions this evening that Colonel Thorne's Purple Heart was awarded for minor injuries or training accidents. I want to correct that misconception immediately. General Rodriguez took over, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the events he was describing. Colonel Thorne earned her Purple Heart during Operation Mountain Shield, a classified mission that prevented a coordinated terrorist attack on a refugee camp housing over 2,000 civilian families. When her convoy was ambushed, she was pinned under an overturned vehicle with shrapnel lodged near her spine. The students found themselves holding their breath, unable to look away as the reality of Victoria's service was laid out before them with military precision. For 6 hours, General Rodriguez continued. While wounded and under continuous enemy fire, Colonel Thorne maintained command of her remaining troops, coordinated defensive positions, and developed tactical countermeasures that prevented the enemy from overrunning their position. 2 of her soldiers died that night covering her position. She stayed conscious and in command until air support could reach them. Tyler Brooks' documentary camera continued recording automatically, but he no longer had any idea what kind of film he was making. The footage he had intended to use to expose military mythology was instead documenting his own ignorance and the casual cruelty of people who had never been tested by real adversity. General Kim looked up from her tablet, her intelligence background evident in the way she assessed the room's dynamics. The tactical innovations Colonel Thorne developed during that engagement have since been implemented to protect military and civilian populations worldwide. The defensive strategies she created while wounded and under fire have prevented numerous attacks and saved thousands of lives. Madison Carter, who had suggested that Victoria needed to move past her military identity and discover who she really was, without medals and uniforms, now understood that she had been lecturing someone whose identity was inextricably linked to saving human lives on a scale she could barely comprehend. Jake's live stream audience had grown to over 10,000 viewers, many of whom were military personnel and veterans who were beginning to piece together the identity of the colonel being discussed. Comments were flooding in from people who recognized the operational details being described, who had studied Victoria's tactical innovations in their own military training, who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. General Morrison stepped closer to the booth where Professor Hartwell sat frozen, her 4 stars catching the diner's light as she moved. "Professor Hartwell, I believe. I'm familiar with your work on military mythology and manufactured heroism. I'm curious about your thoughts on the distinction between theoretical analysis and practical reality." The professor found himself unable to form a coherent response. The woman standing before him commanded respect from world leaders, had shaped military policy at the highest levels, and represented everything his theories had attempted to dismiss as propaganda. But her presence was undeniably real, her authority unquestionably earned, and her very existence a challenge to every assumption he had made about military service. "Colonel Thorne," General Morrison called toward the diner's entrance. "Could you join us, please?" Victoria entered wearing her dress uniform, the Purple Heart, joined by a collection of other decorations that told the story of a career spent in service to something greater than herself. But more than the medals, more than the uniform, there was something in her bearing that commanded immediate respect, the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested by the worst humanity could offer and had emerged not just intact, but stronger. The transformation was complete. The woman the students had spent the evening systematically humiliating was revealed to be someone whose service record placed her among the most respected military leaders of her generation. And now, as she stood before them in uniform, surrounded by the generals who had come to collect her, the true magnitude of their evening's cruelty was about to be fully revealed. Victoria entered the diner with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. Her dress uniform was immaculate, each ribbon and decoration precisely placed according to military regulations that had been drilled into her through decades of service. But it wasn't the uniform that transformed the atmosphere in the Copper Kettle. It was the quiet confidence that radiated from someone who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. General Morrison gestured toward Victoria with the kind of respect reserved for military legends. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Brigadier General Victoria Thorne. Though as of 30 minutes ago, she's been promoted to Major General at the direct request of the President of the United States." The words hit the room like a physical blow. The college students who had spent the evening mocking her participation trophy now stared at someone who had just been personally promoted by the Commander-in-Chief. Professor Hartwell's face went ashen as he realized that his evening's victim was someone whose name was apparently known in the Oval Office. General Rodriguez stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio that contained documents with classification markings the students had only seen in movies. "I want to read you the citation for Major General Thorne's Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor that can be awarded to a member of the United States Army." His voice took on the formal cadence reserved for official military communications. "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed..." Victoria entered wearing her dress uniform, the Purple Heart, joined by a collection of other decorations that told the story of a career spent in service to something greater than herself. But more than the medals, more than the uniform, there was something in her bearing that commanded immediate respect, the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested by the worst humanity could offer and had emerged not just intact, but stronger. The transformation was complete. The woman the students had spent the evening systematically humiliating was revealed to be someone whose service record placed her among the most respected military leaders of her generation. And now, as she stood before them in uniform, surrounded by the generals who had come to collect her, The true magnitude of their evening's cruelty was about to be fully revealed. Victoria entered the diner with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. Her dress uniform was immaculate, each ribbon and decoration precisely placed according to military regulations that had been drilled into her through decades of service. But it wasn't the uniform that transformed the atmosphere in the Copper Kettle. It was the quiet confidence that radiated from someone who had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. General Morrison gestured toward Victoria with the kind of respect reserved for military legends. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Brigadier General Victoria Thorne. Though as of 30 minutes ago, she's been promoted to Major General at the direct request of the President of the United States." The words hit the room like a physical blow. The college students who had spent the evening mocking her participation trophy now stared at someone who had just been personally promoted by the Commander-in-Chief. Professor Hartwell's face went ashen as he realized that his evening's victim was someone whose name was apparently known in the Oval Office. General Rodriguez stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio that contained documents with classification markings the students had only seen in movies. "I want to read you the citation for Major General Thorne's Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor that can be awarded to a member of the United States Army." His voice took on the formal cadence reserved for official military communications. "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force. On the night of October 15th, Major General Thorne, then serving as Lieutenant Colonel, demonstrated exceptional valor when her convoy came under coordinated attack by a numerically superior enemy force, approximately 30 kilometers outside Kandahar, Afghanistan." Brad Westfield felt his knees buckle as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. He had mocked someone whose heroism was officially recognized at the highest levels of government, someone whose actions had been deemed worthy of the nation's second highest decoration for valor. When the lead vehicle in her convoy struck an improvised explosive device, General Rodriguez continued, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne was thrown from the vehicle and sustained multiple injuries including a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs and a piece of shrapnel lodged dangerously close to her spinal column. The students could hear every word clearly in the absolute silence that had fallen over the diner. Even the ambient sounds of the kitchen had stopped as Dorothy and her staff listened to the recitation of events that revealed the true cost of the Purple Heart they had spent the evening dismissing. Despite her injuries, General Rodriguez read, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne immediately took command of the surviving members of her unit and organized a defensive perimeter around the disabled vehicles. When it became clear that the enemy intended to execute a coordinated assault on the nearby refugee camp, she made the tactical decision to hold her position despite being outnumbered 4-1. Amber Rodriguez felt physically sick as she remembered her own words, "That old medal doesn't make you special." The medal she had dismissed represented a night of heroism that was being read into the official record by a 3-star general in front of an audience that was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had witnessed. General Kim took over the reading, her intelligence background evident in the precise way she delivered the operational details. For 6 hours and 17 minutes, while wounded and under continuous enemy fire, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne maintained tactical command of her position. During this time, she coordinated air support, directed medical evacuation procedures for wounded personnel, and developed innovative defensive countermeasures that prevented enemy forces from advancing toward the civilian population. Emma Sinclair, who had offered to help Victoria process her trauma and move past her artificial military identity, now realized that she had been lecturing someone whose psychological strength had enabled her to function as a tactical commander. While wounded and under enemy fire for over 6 hours, The therapeutic insights she had so confidently shared were revealed as the presumptuous assumptions of someone who had never faced genuine life-or-death adversity. The enemy force consisted of approximately 40 insurgents armed with rocket-propelled grenades, automatic weapons, and improvised explosive devices, General Kim continued. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne's position was defended by herself and 8 surviving members of her unit, 2 of whom were severely wounded and unable to participate in combat operations. Tyler Brooks' documentary camera continued recording, but he no longer had any framework for understanding what he was documenting. The footage he had intended to use to expose military mythology was instead capturing the systematic destruction of his own worldview by generals who were reading from official military records. General Morrison took the portfolio and turned to a page marked with the highest security classifications. I want to read you the portion of Major General Thorne's citation that was classified until today, released only because the current terrorist threat requires public understanding of her capabilities. The room seemed to hold its breath as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff prepared to reveal information that had been deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. During the engagement, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne identified a pattern in the enemy's assault tactics that indicated preparation for a larger operation targeting the refugee camp. Using tactical knowledge gained through previous deployments, she developed a series of defensive countermeasures that not only protected her immediate position, but also provided early warning to coalition forces responsible for camp security. Jake's live stream audience had grown to over 15,000 viewers, many of whom were military personnel. General Kim stepped forward with additional documents. Major General Thorne's innovations during Operation Mountain Shield have been implemented in protection protocols for refugee camps, civilian evacuation procedures, and convoy security measures. Worldwide, military academies in 17 countries now teach tactical courses based on her decisions during that engagement. Derek, the philosophy major who had lectured about military honor being based on tribalistic thinking, found his theoretical frameworks completely inadequate for processing what he was hearing. The woman he had dismissed as morally inferior for choosing violence over nonviolent conflict resolution had prevented a massacre of civilians while wounded and outnumbered. Victoria stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of having her most painful memories recounted in front of an audience that had spent the evening systematically attacking everything she represented. Generals, if I may address the students directly? General Morrison nodded, stepping aside to allow Victoria to speak to the people who had spent the evening questioning her worth, her service, and her right to wear the decorations she had earned through blood and sacrifice. Brad, Amber, Emma, Jake, Tyler, Madison, Derek, Victoria said, addressing each student by name with the kind of attention to detail that marked professional military officers. Professor Hartwell, you spent this evening challenging my right to wear this Purple Heart, questioning the value of military service, and suggesting that military decorations are meaningless symbols designed to manipulate public opinion. The students found themselves unable to look away, trapped by the quiet authority of someone who had just been revealed to be one of the most decorated military officers of her generation. I want you to understand something, Victoria continued, her voice carrying the weight of experience that could never be gained in classrooms or lecture halls. 2 soldiers died protecting my position that night. Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Washington gave their lives so that I could continue commanding the defense of those refugee families. Every time I wear this Purple Heart, I carry their sacrifice with me. The revelation hit the room like an artillery shell, transforming the students' understanding of everything they had witnessed. The medal they had mocked wasn't just recognition of Victoria's own sacrifice. It was a memorial to soldiers who had died protecting her position while she held the line against overwhelming odds. The silence that followed Victoria's revelation was deafening. The weight of her words that 2 soldiers had died protecting her position while she commanded the defense of over 2,000 civilians settled over the diner like a physical presence. The college students who had spent the evening mocking her participation trophy now understood that they had been attacking a memorial to fallen heroes. Brad Westfield was the first to break, his legs giving out as he sank back into his booth. The expensive sweater that had made him feel sophisticated and worldly now seemed like a costume worn by a child playing at being an adult. His face had gone completely pale, and his hands trembled as he tried to process the magnitude of what he had done. I called it a participation trophy, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I asked if you got it for a paper cut. Victoria looked at him with the same steady gaze she had maintained throughout the evening's assault, but now her expression carried the weight of someone who had seen far worse cruelty than anything a privileged college student could inflict. Brad, you didn't know. None of you knew. But that's exactly the point. You made assumptions about something you didn't understand. Amber Rodriguez had begun crying, her carefully constructed image of intellectual superiority crumbling as she confronted the reality of her actions. I said that old medal doesn't make you special, she sobbed. I said it right to your face, and you just sat there and took it. Because responding with anger wouldn't have changed your mind, Victoria replied quietly. And because I've learned that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially not with people who have never faced real consequences for their words. Emma Sinclair stood up abruptly, her psychology textbooks and theoretical knowledge suddenly seeming woefully inadequate for understanding the woman before her. I offered to help you process your trauma, she said, her voice breaking with shame. I told you that you needed counseling to move past your artificial military identity. I treated you like a patient instead of someone who saved thousands of lives. Victoria's expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the compassion that had driven her to protect civilian populations, even at the cost of her own safety. Emma, your desire to help people isn't wrong. But sometimes the people you're trying to help understand their experiences better than you do. Sometimes listening is more valuable than analyzing. Jake had stopped his live stream, his phone forgotten, in his lap as he stared at Victoria with a mixture of horror and dawning respect. My documentary, he said numbly. I was making a documentary about military mythology, about how society creates false heroes to justify war, and I was going to use tonight as evidence. What will you do with the footage now? General Morrison asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about how civilian perspectives could change when confronted with reality. Jake looked at his phone, then back at Victoria, then at the 3 generals who represented everything his academic training had taught him to question. I don't know, he admitted. Everything I thought I knew about military service, about heroism, about the difference between propaganda and reality, it's all wrong, isn't it? Tyler lowered his camera completely, the documentary project that had seemed so important just hours before now revealed as the product of ignorance and academic arrogance. I filmed everything, he said quietly. I filmed us attacking someone who prevented a massacre. I filmed us mocking someone whose tactical innovations have saved thousands of lives. I filmed us being cruel to someone who was willing to die protecting strangers. Madison Carter had buried her face in her hands, her sociology degree and theoretical understanding of social structures suddenly seeming like children's toys compared to the reality of someone who had actually shaped society through direct action. I told you to move past your military identity, she whispered. I said you needed to figure out who you really were without the uniform and medals. But this is who you are, isn't it? This is exactly who you are. Victoria nodded slowly. The uniform and medals don't make me who I am, Madison. But they represent choices I made, actions I took, and responsibilities I accepted. You can't separate a person from their experiences, especially experiences that cost other people their lives. Derek, the philosophy major who had lectured about the immorality of military action, found his ethical frameworks completely inadequate for addressing what he had witnessed. I said that choosing violence on behalf of the state doesn't make you morally superior to people who choose nonviolent approaches, he said, his voice hollow with shame. But you didn't choose violence. You chose to protect innocent people. You chose to save children. Derek, Victoria replied, the choice isn't between violence and nonviolence in a perfect world. The choice is between protecting innocent people and allowing them to be slaughtered. Sometimes the only nonviolent option is to be violent enough to stop greater violence. Professor Hartwell sat motionless in his booth, 30 years of academic theory crumbling around him like a house of cards in an earthquake. The woman he had dismissed as a victim of military propaganda had just been revealed as someone whose tactical innovations were taught in military academies worldwide, whose decisions under fire had prevented a massacre, whose service record placed her among the most respected military leaders of her generation. Professor, General Rodriguez said, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the realities that Hartwell had only theorized about. You've built a career on the premise that military heroism is manufactured propaganda. What's your assessment of Major General Thorne's service record? Hartwell tried to speak several times before words finally emerged. My research. My books. I spent 30 years studying military culture from the outside, analyzing it as a social phenomenon, deconstructing it as mythology. But I never considered that some of it might actually be real. Most of it is real, General Kim interjected, her intelligence background evident in the precise way she delivered information. The propaganda exists to highlight real heroism, not to manufacture false heroism. The difference is that the real heroism often remains classified to protect operational security. Lindsay, the pink-haired student who had recorded selfie videos with Victoria in the background, deleted her social media accounts entirely, unable to face the thought that her mockery of a genuine hero might exist somewhere in digital permanence. I filmed myself laughing at you, she whispered. I posted videos making fun of someone who saved over 2,000 people. Dorothy Martinez finally found her voice, stepping out from behind the counter with tears streaming down her face. Victoria. Honey, why didn't you ever say anything? All these months you've been coming in here, eating dinner alone, and we never knew. Victoria turned to the woman who had served her meals and offered quiet kindness during her darkest civilian moments. Dorothy, what would I have said? That I used to be important? That I used to command respect? That I've done things most people can't imagine? It would have sounded like bragging or attention-seeking. Exactly what these students accused me of tonight. Pete Garrison stood up slowly, his weathered face reflecting a lifetime of military service and the deep respect of one veteran for another. Without saying a word, he walked over to Victoria and rendered a perfect military salute, his eyes conveying everything that words couldn't express about honor, sacrifice, and recognition of extraordinary service. Victoria returned the salute with the crisp precision that marked professional military officers, a moment of communication between warriors that transcended the need for civilian understanding. When Pete lowered his hand, there were tears in his eyes. Ma'am, he said, his voice thick with emotion, it's been an honor sharing this town with you, even if I didn't know who you were. The Morrison family approached hesitantly, Jim Morrison's face reflecting the shame of a father who realized his daughters had witnessed him showing casual disrespect to someone whose service deserved the highest honor. General Thorne, he said, struggling with the unfamiliar rank, I don't know how to apologize for not recognizing what you've done for this country. Victoria smiled for the first time since the evening began, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her from a military legend back into the quiet woman who had helped his family with their hardware store projects. Jim, you don't owe me an apology. You treated me with kindness and respect as a customer and neighbor. That's all anyone can ask for. Sarah Chun gathered her papers with shaking hands, her red pen forgotten as she tried to process the revelation that she had been sharing her quiet library with someone whose tactical innovations were taught in military academies around the world. The books you checked out, she said suddenly. Military history, strategic studies, conflict analysis. I thought you were just interested in history. I was keeping up with developments in my field, Victoria replied. Staying current with tactical innovations, studying how warfare was evolving. Old habits from someone who spent her career trying to stay ahead of threats. General Morrison checked her watch, the weight of national security responsibilities requiring her to balance respect for the emotional moment with the urgency of the mission ahead. Major General Thorne, we need to depart for the operational briefing. The situation requires immediate attention. Victoria nodded, understanding that her brief return to civilian life was ending, perhaps permanently. The quiet woman who had worked at Henderson's hardware store and eaten solitary dinners at the Copper Kettle was being recalled to a world where her decisions would once again carry the weight of life and death. She turned to face the college students who had spent the evening systematically attacking everything she represented. I want you to understand something, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. What happened tonight wasn't about military versus civilian or conservative versus liberal or any other political division. It was about the difference between making assumptions and seeking understanding. The students found themselves nodding, their earlier confidence replaced by a humility born from confronting the reality of their own ignorance and cruelty. Learn from this, Victoria continued. Not just about military service, but about judging people before you understand their stories. Everyone you meet is carrying experiences you can't see, fighting battles you don't know about, bearing responsibilities you can't imagine. As she walked toward the door, flanked by the three generals who had come to collect her, Victoria paused. One final time. And remember that the freedom to question authority, to challenge systems, to speak your minds without fear, that freedom exists because people you'll never meet made sacrifices you'll never know about. The door closed behind the four military officers, leaving the Copper Kettle Diner, transformed by an encounter that none of its occupants would ever forget. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as the Black Hawk lifted off from Millbrook Falls Municipal Airfield, carrying Major General Victoria Thorne back to a world where her tactical expertise would once again be deployed in defense of innocent lives. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the lights of the small mountain town growing smaller below. The Copper Kettle Diner, just one small point of light among many that represented the civilian population she had sworn to protect. Inside the diner, the aftermath of the evening's revelations settled over the remaining occupants like the quiet after a thunderstorm. The college students sat in stunned silence, their phones forgotten, their social media posts deleted, their academic confidence replaced by a humility born from confronting the reality of their own ignorance and casual cruelty. Professor Hartwell remained motionless in his booth, staring at the table where 30 years of academic theory had been systematically dismantled by classified military records and the testimony of generals who had lived through the realities he had only theorized about. His books on military mythology suddenly seemed like the work of someone who had studied shadows on cave walls while remaining ignorant of the world outside. Jake was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. We destroyed someone tonight, someone who saved thousands of lives, someone who prevented a massacre of children, and we filmed it. We actually filmed ourselves being cruel to a genuine hero. Tyler nodded slowly, his documentary equipment packed away, his thesis about manufactured military heroism revealed as the product of someone who had never encountered the real thing. I keep thinking about what she said at the end, about freedom existing because of sacrifices we'll never know about. We used our freedom to attack someone who had protected that freedom with her life. Emma had been crying quietly for the past 20 minutes, her psychology textbook seeming woefully inadequate for understanding the complexity of someone who could function as a tactical commander while wounded and under fire for over 6 hours. I offered her therapy, she said, her voice breaking. I told someone who commanded the defense of 2,000 civilians that she needed help processing her artificial military identity, the arrogance, the complete, absolute arrogance of thinking I understood her experiences better than she did. Amber wiped her eyes with shaking hands, her multiple piercings and provocative t-shirt now seeming like the costume of someone playing at rebellion without understanding what real resistance looked like. She saved over 1,000 children. Over 1,000 children, and I told her that her medal didn't make her special. I looked at a memorial to fallen soldiers and called it meaningless. Brad had not spoken since Victoria's departure, his expensive education and privileged background suddenly seeming like barriers to understanding rather than advantages. When he finally found his voice, it emerged hollow with shame. My grandfather was a veteran. World War II. He never talked about what he did, never wore his medals, never asked for recognition. I used to think he was just being modest. Now, I understand he probably saw things, did things, that he couldn't explain to someone who hadn't been there. Madison gathered her sociology notes with trembling hands, her academic understanding of social structures revealed as theoretical constructs divorced from the reality of people who actually shape society through direct action. I told her to move past her military identity and figure out who she really was without uniforms and medals. But her identity isn't separate from her service. It's inseparable from the choices she made, the responsibilities she accepted, the people she saved. Derek, whose philosophical frameworks had crumbled when confronted with the ethical complexity of protecting innocent lives through force, stared at his notes on deconstructive ethics with newfound skepticism. I spent the evening lecturing about moral superiority while talking to someone who had made life-and-death decisions to protect strangers, someone who had chosen to sacrifice her own safety to prevent the murder of children. And I called it tribalistic thinking. Lindsay had deleted all her social media accounts, unable to face the possibility that her mockery of a genuine hero might exist somewhere in digital permanence. I filmed myself laughing at someone who prevented a massacre, she whispered. I posted videos making fun of someone whose tactical innovations are taught in military academies around the world. How do you come back from something like that?